So how this all works is we're going to have some kind of canvas, which will, the documents represents the things like Excel and Word, conversations, things like Teams, Pages, SharePoint. They're all canvases where we're going to surface some content, and the key thing is we have this manifest file. So the manifest file is really the connection between the canvas, the SharePoint page or the Team or Office application, and the remote website, which, or possibly a service, which is something that can be rendered using any technology you like. So it might be Node.js or ASP.NET or PHP or even static websites, which is a very popular option nowadays. You may or may not have client-side code running as well. It depends what you're trying to build, but you might well be using a lot of client-side code, JavaScript, React.js perhaps as a view engine, and a lot of these are web. This is the sort of mainstream web development tools that we're using, and it means you can build on any operating system as your development environment as well. And then we render that inside this canvas, so we're effectively rendering web content inside the application that we're using. Now we've had a number of ways of extending SharePoint over the years, but the recommended way nowadays is to use the SharePoint framework, which uses this approach of modern client-side development. It's using these modern development tools. It's different from the earlier approaches where because we're using open source development techniques and tooling that are widely adopted in the web development world. And in years past, it often felt as though, as a SharePoint developer, we were a little bit trapped in this legacy world of the old version of ASP.NET, or everybody's moved to ASP.NET MVC except us, and we were struggling to use the latest technologies and JavaScript libraries. No more. We can use whatever framework and development technique we want. We might have some recommendations, but if you want to use Ruby on Rails and Angular v1 and develop an Emacs on an old Sun workstation, that's totally fine. And it's not just Microsoft building. Microsoft are building their own products using these same technology, SharePoint frameworks, so it's had a big impact on quality. Wasn't always the case with earlier technologies, and it also has applications beyond SharePoint. And it's not just code, it's a whole package, the build process, the deployment tools. There's a built-in SharePoint CDN that we can use to deploy the assets for the solution. And surprisingly, for a long time, Microsoft developers, the build process and tooling does not revolve around Visual Studio at all. Instead, we can use any editor, but most people are using Visual Studio Code as the code editor, along with open source tooling like Yeoman templates, Gulp as a build tool, NPM for package management, and all of this is running on top of Node.js, which is Node running on the running server side, but also as a development platform. So that's what's serving things like a SharePoint workbench, which we'll see in a second, which we can use to test the canvas locally. So let's just see that working. If you haven't already seen this before, yes, here we are at the command prompt. And this is the SharePoint framework Yeoman generator. It's yo@Microsoft/SharePoint. Somebody already pinched the SharePoint name, and it's doing the job of file new project, which we would use in Visual Studio, for example, scaffolding out some files. Check out the ASCII art here. So you've probably seen this before. So I'm just going to talk a little bit over while this demonstration's running, but yeah, it does sort of feel as though we've gone back to the 1970s, and I've got to say that as we've gone back to the command line, it feels as though complex IDEs, they're slow. Visual Studio takes ages to install, and we're just finding that this is a very quick way of building solutions, and it works. We've sort of moved to the wider world of web development, and that's the direction that web developers as a whole have gone, and we've gone for these simpler tools. So that's the Yeoman generator has scaffolded out the project. It's I've speeded that up a little bit, but it usually takes a little bit longer to get all the dependencies set up. This is Visual Studio Code, and here we can just see the structure of the file structure of the solution. It isn't really a project file like in Visual Studio. There are various source files here, so this is actually a React component that we're building here. No time really to go into that, but it's one of several ways that you can render views in using JavaScript in client-side code. Then we use a gulp serve is a command that we're running to then render this page. It's actually running locally, so you'll see when this starts up, it's going to set up this local workbench, which is just really a web page that it's serving the web part inside. So if you look at the URL, you can see it's being served locally. There's no server involved, so you can develop this on a plane if you want to. And then this is the SharePoint workbench, so it's not a real SharePoint page, it's a fake one that's just served locally, but you can use it to test and do some development of your SharePoint web part on your local machine. Now, of course, in practice we're going to deploy this to SharePoint, and if we had a little bit more time we could go through the process of maybe modifying this example and actually deploying it, but in the interests of time I'm going to move on because we've got a few other things to cover. So Teams, of course, can also be extended. So when we look at Teams, we see it's designed to be has a lot of extension points, bots and messaging extensions and connectors, but we're going to actually focus on Teams tabs, which appear along the top of the pane when you're looking at your channel. And that's by far the easiest way to extend Teams. A tab can just be some external web page or website, or you can also have conversations around it. So you see how, again, there's a manifest file behind the scenes, and that manifest points to the web content, which might just be a simple page or something more complex with some interaction with Microsoft 365 using the Microsoft graph. And as before, you need to host that somewhere, and it might be an external website, or you might stand up an Azure web app, or maybe you just use a SharePoint page, which is another possibility. But what we can also do is we now have the option to bring SharePoint web parts right into Teams. So I can use the web part that we just built in the previous demo, or would have done if I'd continued it, and use it right inside Teams, which makes a lot of sense actually if we're having a discussion as a team and we want to work on that content. So we can bring it right into Teams. Now, it might be that you design a web part that you can use in both situations. So you might have a web part that makes sense in your SharePoint site and also in Teams, or that might not be the case. It depends on what you're building. It doesn't have to be. So you can control that in the manifest, whether you want it to appear in SharePoint, you want it to be an option for Teams, or both. So how do we build a Teams application? Well, same as before, we'll just quit this gulp serve that we were running. Now, normally there's a deployment process, of course, to deploy that into SharePoint for the web part. So now what we'll do is we'll pretend that I carried on a bit longer with that previous demo and improve this web part a bit more. And now what I want to do is deploy it into Teams as well. So if I go into this manifest file, I've got a few options here. So I can add a Teams tab. I can also use the personal app as well. So I'm going to add an additional supported host. And then once I've done that, I can save the manifest file, and then I go through the steps of deploying the application. So this is pretty much some of these are the steps we would make if we were deploying just a normal web part into SharePoint. So I do a build, and I've speeded some of this up a little bit. It might take you, don't be disappointed if it takes a little bit longer when you actually do this yourself. And then we need to do gulp bundle ship, which packages everything up. So a few more folders will appear in that file hierarchy that we originally scaffolded out as it does the build. And then we can say gulp package solution, and that needs the -- ship option as well. So everything happening on the command line here. And now what we have is, if you look in the folder structure, there's this extra output folder called SharePoint, which has got the solution in, and then there's a SharePoint package which we can just deploy in the normal way. So this step is really the same as a normal solution deployment. So we'll actually see this now. And so I need to dig around a little bit to find, so this is in SharePoint Online. I have to find in the admin center, I want to get to the app catalog, which is sometimes a little bit tricky to find. So I'm going to go to apps and go to my app catalog and get one of these classic pages. And the app catalog is really just a SharePoint list, and we're going to drop this solution package that we've created into the app catalog. This is where a bit of magic happens. Recommended practice is to make it tenant-wide deployment, which makes it somewhat easier to manage this. And once that has been added to the app catalog, I have to find it. So it's that Facilitate client-side solution, and there's this extra button lights up in the ribbon, which is sync to Teams, if you've set that property in the manifest file, which we saw earlier in the demo. And at that point, then I can then add that will then deploy the Teams manifest file, and then I'm able to add it. I'll need to refresh this page because I've just added it, and then I can add a new tab, and I'll then get the option. You see, I've done this a few times, and I'll get the option to, if I can find it, I'll get the option to add that solution that we just created there into the Teams as a Teams tab, and then it will behave in much the same way as it did or would have done if we'd shown it in a SharePoint site. So this is actually a web part that's being rendered inside the Teams site.